right, welcome back. We just concluded existentialism, and one of the things I said in the last video is I would only introduce one or two theorists per topic, and I'm already going to violate that promise. In humanism, I'm going to introduce three theorists. Under the giant umbrella called humanism, there's this overarching philosophy that emphasizes the personal worth of the individual and the importance of human values. This is considered the third force of psychology after psychoanalysis and behaviorism. So if you think about humanism being in a large part a reaction to the things that psychoanalysis taught us and behaviorism taught us, the theory will make a lot more sense for you. Remember that psychoanalysis argued that we're driven by sort of our unconscious and unappealing kinds of motives. You know, we've got aggression and sex at the base of everything. And that really for psychoanalysis, it's the job of the environment to teach us to restrain those impulses, to socialize us so that we'll behave in a reality principle-based way. Behaviorism took the position that you're basically a blank slate, and just all of your personality is a function of your unique experiences of rewards and punishments for different behaviors that you've engaged in. And so they take very different perspectives, but in both of these theories, there's a lot of sort of negativity involved, right? That on the one hand in psychoanalysis, that you have these unconscious motives that you can't really control, and that you have to learn to, let your superego grow and let your ego be strong enough to balance the demands of these unconscious id motives. And it's all about the environment sort of giving you consequences so that you'll learn to control your baser instincts. Behaviorism has this overarching dark message of, control, that the environment can control you to behave in ways that, behaviorism never even really talked about what the person might want to do. Like you don't have any innate wants in behaviorism. You just are reacting to what the environment does to you. Well, this is very different from humanism. Both of those are very different from humanism. Humanism says that we all are individually worthwhile, that all of us have value, and that there's something, again, unique about humans, and that the things that humans value are important and worth preserving. So I promised you three theorists, so let me introduce them to you. Erich Fromm, Carl Rogers, and Abraham Maslow. You're going to notice that we spend most of our time talking about Rogers, but these other two theorists added some really interesting components to the, this overarching umbrella of humanism that I think is worth talking about. And all of these theorists influenced each other really heavily. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow in particular were really good friends who, challenged each other, encouraged each other to expand theories, and they actually even adopted terms from each other. They weren't quite as tight as, Freud and Jung, which ultimately caused this disastrous breakup between Freud and Jung. But I mean, they were really honestly, they were cohorts and peers and colleagues. All right, let's start with Erich Fromm. So one of the first things that I wanted to share with you about Fromm's theory is his emphasis on love. He says that love allows us to overcome our isolation, but still maintain our individual integrity. He thought it was really important for people when they're in a relationship with someone else, and this could be, by the way, different kinds of love, romantic love or love that we feel towards our children or our parents. These are different kinds of love. The love that you might feel towards a friend. All of these are kind of different, but they're all the same kind of human motive. We don't want to feel alone and isolated, but we also don't want to feel controlled by someone else, he says. We want to maintain our individual integrity, the sense that we're behaving in ways that we choose to do, unlike what behaviorists say, right? He says that loving is an art. It's something that we have to learn. It's something that we have to practice all the time, and that sometimes, what we produce under the theory of love is beautiful, and sometimes what we produce is not as good, but that we're always working on it. Now, it's important to note when he was working, 1940s, 50s, 60s. So for him to say modern society encourages existential alienation might be surprising, because he was talking about his time period. And, you know, a lot of us today think that it's unique to us that now that we have our cell phones and the internet, and we don't have to really get together with people in order to have connections and stuff like that, that this is new, this existential alienation. He thought it was new in his time period. You know, I wonder to what extent, you know, people in the 1800s thought that modern society encourages existential alienation. I mean, I wonder how much this sense of existential alienation is really just part of the human condition. You know, this sense that, you know, because we have all these things to do. I mean, imagine an agrarian society where everybody has to tend to their own crops and things like that, and they only really get together for like market days. You can imagine that that was existentially isolating, right? That they maybe felt alienated from their peers and from the people around them. So I have a sneaking suspicion that that's just part of the human situation, is that, you know, we have, you know, this desire to be connected to other people, but maybe not the means. I'll just give you an example from my adult perspective. It's been difficult making friends as an adult, in large part because if you extend, as an adult with children, I have to say, when I was a young adult and didn't have kids, it was a little bit easier as long as I was only hanging around with other young adults who didn't have kids. Kids are really a time suck, nothing personal to all of us who were once children, but they really are kind of a time suck, because you sort of have to get them to bed at a certain time, and they have their interests that you have to fulfill in order to help them to grow and develop. And I mean, it's just really, at that time period when I had children is when I started having a lot of difficulty making new friends. I moved when my daughter was 1.5 years to the Northwest, didn't know anyone, and had a lot of difficulty trying to really reach out to anybody around me and like have a time where I could say, hey, do you want to go out to dinner? Oh, we're busy that night. You know, they'd ask me to do something and I'd be like, oh man, I can't, we're gonna be out of town that week. You know, it would go back and forth like that. And, you know, it just feels like, you know, having your own little nucleus that you're working on oftentimes contributes to existential alienation also. And I think that is probably true throughout time. In fact, I talked to my grandfather, who was an adult. You know, he got married in 1938, so we're going to call him an adult in the 30s and 40s. I think he was 24 when he got married. And I was talking to him about feeling isolated, and like, you know, my historical friends, high school, so on, you know, they still lived back in California. I'm in Washington, trying to make new friends. And he said, you know what? It was exactly like that for your grandma and I when your mom and uncle were little. It was hard. And he said, the good news is that, you know, you guys, once the kids are out of the house, you start coming back to your old friends. And you know what? It turns out he's right. But I think having that intergenerational perspective reminded me that I don't know if we should say modern society. Anyway, sorry, I don't mean to criticize Fromm so vehemently, but it just feels like he's, you know, maybe a moment in time, and he thinks, okay, this is unique. And I think we all feel like that. If it weren't for the internet and our cell phones, we'd all be connected. And here he is, pre-internet and cell phones, and he's saying we're not connected. Anyway, so since 1950, let's look at some evidence that he might be correct. And like we have these numbers that have stayed relatively stable since you know, probably 1980. A lot of these numbers have stayed relatively stable, but divorce rate doubled between 1950 and 1980, really leveled off after that, but double. So here we're having you know, the breakdown of the nuclear family, he would say. Out of wedlock birth rate was 7 times in 1980 what it was in 1950. So he would argue again the breakdown of the family, and so that people don't feel connected and people might feel isolated. You know, the percent of the population that was in prison by 1980 was 5 times what it had been in 1950. And then reported anxiety and depression, you know, up 5 to 10 times depending what source you look at. And depression and anxiety are actually the one thing that has continued to increase. We're seeing even higher rates of anxiety and depression than we did in the 1980s. And that's pre-COVID data. The COVID data, I would like to argue, is going to be a spike, but hopefully it will return to, you know, a baseline again, hopefully. So he's arguing that there's something about modern society, especially, you know, this really fast increase in technology and things like that that were happening from the mid-1900s on, that really were isolating us at a rate that humans weren't used to. And they were having these detectable effects. Now, he practiced something called dialectical humanism, where he was trying to reconcile the biological side of humanity and the pressure of social structure on the other side. And so, we have, like, he still agrees, like Isaac said, certain biological predispositions, right? That maybe our brains are wired in certain ways, and that maybe we have these, like, natural, sort of instinctual ways to react to the environment. And that might be construed as, like, part of our personality, to just have, sort of without thinking, this is how we react. But then he says also we've got, society telling us how to act and what's appropriate, what's okay, things like that. And so dialectical humanism is attempting to sort of balance these biological forces and these social forces to try and figure out, how these interact to produce the person's personality. Now, he says that because of the presence of free will, we can rise above our biological instincts. And because of free will, we can resist the pressure from society. This is different from both Freudian theory and behaviorism, isn't it? Where, Freudian theory didn't think we had free will to override our id impulses. We were unaware of our impulses, according to Freud. So it was strictly societal structure that was going to help us to not give in to our id impulses. And then with behaviorism, it was all, societal structure that's going to determine how we act. And we don't act that way because of free will. We act like that because we got rewarded for the desirable behaviors, or we got punished or ignored for the advantageous behaviors. And so those became part of our personality, right? We behaved in ways that were consistent because of the feedback we've gotten from society, and didn't even really talk at all about a biological side in behaviorism. So humanism is attempting to go beyond both of the other two main forces in psychology and explain our behaviors as being, sort of uniquely human. And dialectical humanism allowed him to do that. All right, that's all I wanted to say about Fromm. Next up is Carl Rogers, and I think he's going to take at least one segment of lecturing. So I'm going to stop here, and we will come back and we'll talk about Carl Rogers.